The movie starts out with Marion Crane having a task to do for her boss, which is to deposit $40,000 into a bank account. She arrives home instead and she packs her bags and leaves. Marion decides to steal that money. Marion drives to a car dealership and trades her car in for a new one. As she drives away in her new car, she makes a wrong turn into the Bates Motel. This is where she will meet Norman Bates, the main character of the movie, who seems to be very kind and sweet at first, abruptly starts to act strange and progressively becomes more violent. So when Marion checks in the hotel, Norman acts like a normal person and seems to be very caring. He even makes Marion dinner. However, when they both start talking, Norman starts to act very strangely, starting with his hobbies that include making taxidermies. When Norman starts talking about his mother, things start to take a turn, and the background music in the movie gives a hint that something is wrong with him. His facial expressions and his voice also gives hints. After Marion leaves his house, Norman spies on her to see what she is doing. Marion starts taking a shower and Norman stabs Marion to death. Norman is briefly seen running away in woman's clothing after stabbing her. Norman undresses, then storms back into her motel room and cleans the mess. He puts her corpse and her belongings in her car. Norman drives to a lake of mud and sinks her car in there. New characters are introduced into the story at this point. Their names are Lila, which is Marion's sister, and Sam, Marion's boyfriend. Lila is concerned that Marion is missing, as she has not been answering her calls. Also, Detective Arbogast is introduced, and he is going to help investigate Marion's disappearance. Detective Arbogast is depicted going motel to motel until Arbogast arrives at Bates Motel. He then starts to question Norman about Marion, asking him if she looks familiar. The detective finds out that the alias that Marion used to check in the motel is the same as the one that the detective knew about. Norman starts to respond nervously and seems unsure of himself. Norman says that she checked in one night and made her some dinner, and then checked out the next morning. They go outside, and the detective asks if anyone is home. Norman responds by saying that his mother is there, and he was very defensive when Arbogast asked about Norman's mother. Arbogast calls Lila regarding the conversation that Norman and him had about Marion. Arbogast has a suspicious feeling about the situation at this point. Arbogast comes back into the motel looking for Norman. Arbogast decides to walk into Norman's house. As Arbogast slowly walks up the stairs, Norman, again dressed as his mother, stabs Arbogast several times, and he falls down the stairs and finishes him with one last stab in the chest. Lila and Sam wait for Arbogast to call back. Lila wants to go look for Marion, but Sam leaves first, as Sam thinks that Arbogast might stop by Lila's place. Sam calls his name loudly when he arrives, several times, and he is nowhere to be found. Sam returns to Lila and tells her that he can't be found in Bates Motel. Sam and Lila knew local deputy sheriff Al Chambers, and they stopped by his place to explain what Arbogast knew about Marion's disappearance, and that all of a sudden that Arbogast is missing. Lila convinces deputy sheriff to call the Bates Motel. Norman says that the police detective was there and asked him for some information and just left. Al Chambers tells Lila and Sam that Norman's mother has been dead for 10 years. Sam and Lila create a plan to get into the Bates Motel by portraying as husband and wife. They are actually going to check the whole entire place to see if they can find any signs of Marion. They sign in the motel, and Norman can tell that something is off with them. They begin searching through cabin 1, which is the cabin that Marion stayed in and was murdered in. Lila finds a small piece of paper in a trash can of the bathroom where Marion was subtracting and adding something from $40,000 that she stole. Sam distracts Norman by pretending to need something and having a long conversation with him, while Lila sneaks in Norman's house to look for Mrs. Bates. which is Norman's mother. Lila looks around the house for evidence, and Sam and Norman start to get heated into an argument about the $40,000 that Marion had and what his mother had to do with it. Norman hits Sam's head with a small vase that knocks him out. Norman notices that Lila isn't in the cabin, and he rushes into the house. Lila becomes very quiet and very cautious when she notices, and she walks downstairs, which leads to a door. Lila runs into initially what looked like to be a human, and she calls for Mrs. Bates. And the skeleton turns around, and it's not Mrs. Bates. Norman storms in dressed as his mother with a knife, and Sam comes in from behind to save her. They arrive at the police department at this point, and a detective came to the conclusion that Marion in Arbogast was killed by Norman. This detective also so happened to know about Norman's two minds. This detective further explains to Sam and Lila that Norman killed his mother and his lover. After his father died, that is apparently when he became disturbed.
I meant well. People always mean well. They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest oh so very delicately. Of course, I've suggested it myself. But I hate to even think about it. She needs me. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
At this point, Norman starts to show signs of dissociative identity disorder. The following criterion that I found in this particular scene was the fact that his symptoms are causing clinically significant distress or impairment in his social, occupational, and other important areas of his functioning. The she that Norman is referring to in this scene is his mother, which in this case is actually himself. He also mentions that she goes mad sometimes. We all go mad sometimes. His social life is definitely affected, as throughout the whole movie, he never had friends. He
Mrs. Bates.
In the second scene of the movie, the diagnostic criterion that exuded that he has dissociative identity disorder is that Norman has a disruption of identity that is being characterized by two distinct personality states. The good Norman is the kind and sweet person that cared for Marion at first. His personality state changes all of a sudden, and he turns into Mother Norman, and that is when he becomes very violent and murders Marion. In this third scene, the diagnostic criterion that showed that Norman had antisocial personality disorder was his reckless disregard for safety of himself and others. In addition, he is over the age of 18 years old. He has lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. You can see that when Norman kills Marion, he had no hesitation to kill her quickly and run away. In addition, when Norman kills Detective Abergast, he has no regard whatsoever. He stabbed him also without hesitation and showed no signs of remorse for his actions.
It's sad when a mother has to speak the words that condemn her own son, but I couldn't allow them to believe that I would commit murder. They'll put him away now, as I should have, years ago. He was always bad, and in the end he intended to tell them I killed those girls and that man, as if I could do anything except just sit and stare, like one of his stuffed birds. Oh, they know I can't even move a finger, and I won't. I'll just sit here and be quiet, just in case they do suspect me. They're probably watching me. Well, let them. Let them see what kind of a person I am. I'm not even going to swat that fly. I hope they are watching. They'll see. They'll see and they'll know. And they'll say, why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
In this last scene that I show, this is just further evidence of Norman's possession of having dissociative identity disorder. This diagnostic criterion would fall under having a disruption in identity that involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, and cognition. Moreover, the disturbance is not part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. Norman has an internal conflict with himself and his other personality. He essentially talks about the things he's done, and the director Alfred Hitchcock did an amazing job putting things together in the end to make the audience understand why he acts the way he does and how his mind works.